Choosing acoustic strings, where do you begin? I could tell you what I think, but I thought I would go find an expert, Scott from Stringjoy. We're better to start than someone who actually does this for a living. So where do I begin with acoustic strings?
Yeah, great question. So, I mean, when you walk into a guitar store, and especially if you're a beginner player, have never really changed your strings before, you're going to see a giant wall with a bunch of different colors and a million different options. Really hard to know where to start. The ultimate answer for how you find the strings that you're going to like is to try a little bit of everything, because ultimately everyone's a little bit different. You might find that a lighter gauge works for your style, a heavier gauge works for yours. Different alloys can kind of depend. That said, if you want to kind of cut through all that noise and know where to start with, my general recommendations for most people, on the acoustic side, most people will tell you that you should play 12s. These are what's called lights and probably the most common gauge of string. I actually typically recommend people start with 11s, and even for players that have played for a long time, I usually recommend 11s. They tend to have a sweet spot of having a lot of nice volume, but also being very comfortable to play. So I highly recommend just kind of jumping in with 11s. The second question you're going to ask is, what sort of material type do I want? You might have heard of 80-20 bronze, phosphor bronze, coated phosphor bronze, some other more exotic alloys you see here and there. For most players, where I recommend starting is with regular phosphor bronze. You could also start with coated phosphor bronze if you want to go that way. If you're new to it, basically the idea is that coated strings have a little bit of a slicker feel, but they have a coating that prevents them from oxidizing or aging as fast. So really a toss-up there. Some people like the feel of coated strings, other people don't. I typically recommend starting with uncoated and building off from there, but you could really go either way. So again, if you're first starting off, you have no idea what you're going to do, I would say go with 11s in phosphor bronze and kind of start from there. If you want a little bit more volume or comfortable with a little bit more tension, try 12s, maybe even 13s. If even 11s are way too much, you could always go down to 10s, and that'll be really comfortable as well. And then again, as you kind of continue and go on, try out 80-20 bronze, try out coated strings, see what works for you, and ultimately you'll settle on something that you really like and that works great for you.
Let's move on to somebody who isn't a beginner, but maybe hasn't put much thought into their tone, and now is beginning to put thought into their tone. So You mentioned phosphor bronze, 80-20, coated. Who would you gear towards each one of those for somebody who's, again, not a beginner, but really starting to become tone conscious?
Yeah, 100%. So if you're diving a little bit deeper and you're starting to do that experimental phase that I talked about, which everyone kind of has to go through, a couple of good guidelines to think of. Phosphor bronze strings typically have a little bit more of a mid-range hump, which we hear as a little bit of brightness sometimes. They also have a nice sort of full bottom end. A lot of times people will call this a warm sound. And I think that pretty much well encompasses it. It has a warm, comfortable characteristic to it. 80-20 bronze, on the other side, is the original acoustic guitar string alloy. It has a rich bottom end and a rich very top end, and not a lot of information in the middle. Where I do like 80-20 bronze is for players that are singing alongside their acoustic, because having that kind of gap there in the middle of the tonal range gives you a really nice place for your voice to sit in and not be competing with the guitar. Coated strings are a little bit of a different animal because it depends which brand you get them from. If you're getting something like an Elixir coated, more of a traditional coated, they typically are a little bit duller than their uncoated counterparts. So coated phosphor bronze from a lot of those brands will just be a little bit, just a hair duller, but it keeps that tone for longer. At Stringjoy, we have a line called our Foxwoods. That's our coated phosphor bronze. What's unique about those is they're actually brighter than their uncoated counterparts. So typically, if you're starting with our naturals, our regular uncoated phosphor bronze, and you want a little bit more brightness, more presence, or you play a Taylor, you really like the bright tone of those guitars, I would recommend something like our Foxwoods. But again, totally depends on brand there, the exact nature of the coating, what that's going to do tonally for you. The other thing to keep in mind is the gauge of strings that you play has an effect on the tone of the guitar as well. In general, thinner gauges of strings have, well, a thinner tone. A lot of times it's brighter, has a little bit less going on the bottom end. As you get heavier, more close to 12s or 13s, you get a lot more bottom end characteristic in your sound. So again, more of that warmth, as we might call it, more boom, more kind of low end presence there. So depending on where you are with your style and all that, you kind of have two different levers to pull, both the material of the strings as well as the gauge of the strings to determine what the right pick is for you.
I think that's a great starting point when you're looking for acoustic strings. Scott from Stringjoy, check out Stringjoy Strings. I really appreciate the time, man. Thank you.
Thanks so much.